Vanessa adjusted the strap of her dress as she stepped into the dimly lit bar, scanning the crowd for the man she had agreed to meet. Her best friend, Mia, had insisted this blind date would be different. No more self-absorbed finance bros or men who spent the entire evening talking about their gym routines. This time it was someone kind, down to earth and real. Her eyes landed on him, Felix. He was seated at a booth near the window, dressed in a simple black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing his forearms. He had an easy smile, warm brown eyes, and a presence that made the crowded bar feel a little less overwhelming. As she approached, he stood, offering his hand. "Vanessa," she nodded, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, steady. "Felix, the one and only," he grinned, motioning for her to sit. She slid into the booth, taking a moment to study him. He didn't look like the type of guy she usually dated. His confidence was there, but it wasn't flashy or overbearing. He seemed comfortable, as if he had nothing to prove. "So," she started, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Mia says you work in construction," Felix chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Something like that." "I manage projects, oversee things, make sure buildings don't collapse," she laughed. "That's reassuring." He leaned back, watching her with quiet amusement. "And you?" "Mia mentioned you work in publishing." "Yeah, I'm an editor," she said, sipping her drink. "Mostly fiction. I spend my days buried in manuscripts, fixing plot holes and arguing over whether a comma should stay or go." Felix tilted his head. "That actually sounds kind of fun." She raised a brow. "You wouldn't say that if you had to read the same paragraph 20 times because an author refuses to cut a sentence." He laughed, a deep, rich sound that sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Fair point." The conversation flowed easily. She found herself laughing more than she had in months. Felix had a way of making her feel at ease, as if they had known each other for years, instead of minutes. He wasn't trying too hard, wasn't attempting to impress her with grandiose stories or exaggerated accomplishments. He was just himself, and she liked that. By the time they stepped out of the bar, the cool night air brushing against her skin, she realized how much she didn't want the night to end. Felix glanced at his watch. "Do you have time for a walk?" "Yeah," she said without hesitation. They strolled down the quiet city streets, the distant hum of traffic filling the silence between their words. "You're different," she said suddenly, glancing up at him. He looked down at her, amused. "Different how?" she shrugged. "Most guys I've gone out with spend the entire night talking about themselves. You actually listen," Felix smiled. "Well, I like hearing what you have to say." Her heart did an unexpected flip. As they reached the end of the block, Felix hesitated. "Can I see you again?" Vanessa didn't even have to think about it. "Yes." He grinned, and for a brief moment, she felt as if she had just stepped into something she didn't fully understand yet. She had no idea that Felix wasn't just a construction worker. He wasn't just an easygoing guy with a warm smile. He was Felix Hawthorne, the billionaire owner of Hawthorne Industries, one of the largest real estate empires in the country, and she had no idea. Vanessa settled into the plush booth of the coffee shop, her fingers curling around the warm ceramic mug as she waited. She had agreed to meet Felix here for their second date, though calling it a date still felt strangely formal. Their first night together had been effortless, and she was surprised by how much she had thought about him since. There was something about Felix that felt solid, grounded. The door chimed, and she glanced up just as he stepped inside. He was dressed simply again, dark jeans, a fitted sweater, nothing flashy, but there was an undeniable presence about him. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her, and when he smiled, a flicker of warmth spread through her chest. "Hey," he said as he slid into the seat across from her. "Hey yourself," she replied, setting her mug down. "I was starting to think you stood me up." Felix let out a quiet chuckle. "Traffic was brutal." "But I wouldn't have missed this," she arched a brow. "Wouldn't have missed what? Overpriced coffee and uncomfortable seating." He leaned forward slightly. "Seeing you again." Vanessa wasn't used to men saying things like that so easily, without pretense or expectation. She reached for her mug again, mostly to give herself something to do. So what's new in the exciting world of construction? Felix hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, so quick she almost missed it. Same old. Just making sure projects stay on track. Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable, but it was gone before she could place it. And you, he asked. How's the glamorous life of an editor? Glamorous is definitely not the word I'd use, she said with a laugh. I spent half the day trying to convince an author that their main character doesn't need to describe every single meal in excruciating detail. Felix grinned. Sounds like a noble battle. Oh, it is. A war, actually. The conversation shifted, flowing as effortlessly as it had before. Vanessa found herself watching him closely, taking in the way he really listened. He didn't just nod along, waiting for his turn to speak. He asked questions, remembered small details she had mentioned before. It was refreshing. And yet, there was something about him that didn't quite fit. He was too at ease, too composed for someone who worked in construction. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, something that suggested he was used to being in control. But she shrugged the thought away. Maybe he was just one of those rare men who actually had their life together. The afternoon passed quickly, and before she knew it, they were standing outside the cafe, the cool breeze winding through the street. "Walk with me," Felix asked. She hesitated only for a moment before nodding. They moved through the city streets, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. "I have to ask," Vanessa said after a beat. "Why construction?" "You don't seem like the type," Felix glanced at her. "What type do I seem like?" She considered him for a moment. "I don't know, you just seem like you should be doing something bigger. Something with more weight." For the second time that day, there was a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "Maybe I like building things." She narrowed her eyes playfully. "You're avoiding the question," he exhaled, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Let's just say, I have a complicated relationship with my job." Vanessa tilted her head. "That's vague," Felix chuckled. "It's the best I can do for now." She studied him, curiosity buzzing in the back of her mind. There was something he wasn't telling her, but strangely, she didn't feel like he was lying. More like, he was holding something back. She decided to let it go. For now. As they reached the edge of the park, Felix turned to her. "Can I see you again?" Vanessa didn't hesitate. "Yeah, you can." And just like that, she knew she was in trouble. Because Felix wasn't just another guy. He was something different, something unexpected, something that, if she wasn't careful, could change everything. Vanessa adjusted the strap of her heel as she stepped into the grand entryway of the restaurant Felix had chosen for their next date. The ambience was sophisticated. Soft candlelight flickered against the marble walls. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved with precision, and the faint sound of a string quartet hummed in the background. It was far more upscale than she expected from someone who claimed to work in construction. Felix was already waiting at a secluded table near the back, his gaze lifting the moment she entered. He stood as she approached, his expression warm but unreadable. "You look beautiful," he said, pulling out her chair. She smiled, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she sat. "You didn't mention we were going somewhere this fancy. I feel underdressed." Felix's lips curved slightly. "You're perfect." Heat crept up her neck at the way he said it, so certain, so unaffected, as if it was an undeniable fact. She picked up the menu, scanning the prices, and nearly choked. "Felix," she murmured, leaning in, "this place is expensive." His expression remained relaxed. "Don't worry about that. Tonight's about good food and good company." She hesitated, but there was something in his tone that made it impossible to argue. Instead, she let him order for them, watching as he spoke with the waiter with an ease that didn't quite match someone who supposedly worked on construction sites. As the evening went on, Vanessa found herself studying him in a way she hadn't before. The way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his movements, the way the staff seemed to recognize him. There was something about Felix, something unspoken, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he was letting on. "So," she said after their entrees arrived, "I've been thinking." Felix arched a brow, cutting into his steak. Dangerous habit. She ignored the teasing. "You don't really act like someone who spends his days on construction sites." He paused, his knife hovering for just a second before he continued slicing. "How do you think I should act?" She leaned forward slightly. "I don't know, less polished. You seem too comfortable in places like this." Felix set his silverware down, looking at her for a long moment, as if weighing something. "I grew up around a lot of different people. I guess I learned how to adapt." It was an answer, but not the one she was looking for. Before she could press further, a voice interrupted. "Felix?" Vanessa turned to see a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit approaching their table. He was older, maybe mid-50s, and carried himself with the kind of authority that turned heads. Felix's expression remained impassive. "Richard." Vanessa glanced between them, sensing a tension she didn't understand. The man's gaze flickered to her before returning to Felix. "Didn't expect to see you here. Your father said you were keeping a lower profile." Felix's jaw tightened just slightly, but it was enough. "Father." Richard's eyes glimmered with something close to amusement. "I'll let you get back to it, but don't forget your board meeting is coming up. They'll want answers." With that, he walked away, leaving Vanessa staring at Felix, her mind racing. Board meeting, father, low profile. She sat back, her appetite suddenly gone. "Felix." "What was that?" He exhaled slowly, setting his napkin down. "Vanessa, who are you?" There was a long pause before he spoke. "I wanted to tell you myself." She shook her head. "Tell me what?" Felix met her gaze, and for the first time he looked vulnerable. "I don't just work in construction, I own Hawthorne Industries." The name sent a jolt through her. She knew it, everyone did. It was one of the most powerful real estate empires in the country. She stared at him, disbelief settling in. "You're a billionaire." Felix's expression was unreadable. "Yes." The world around her seemed to tilt. The lavish restaurant, the way he ordered without looking at prices, the confidence, it all made sense now. And yet, all she could focus on was the fact that he had lied. Vanessa's pulse roared in her ears as she stared across the table at Felix. The clinking of silverware, the hushed murmurs of other diners, the soft strains of the string quartet, it all faded into background noise. His confession hung between them, heavy and undeniable. He was a billionaire. Felix studied her carefully, his fingers resting against the edge of his glass, as if bracing for her reaction. But she didn't even know how to react. Her mind raced through every moment. They'd shared the casual dates, the effortless charm, the way he had always seemed so grounded. And yet, all along, he had been living a life she couldn't even begin to comprehend. She set her napkin down slowly. "You lied to me." His jaw tensed. "I never lied." He exhaled, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass. "I didn't tell you everything." Vanessa let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "That's a pretty thin line, Felix." His gaze didn't waver. "I wanted to know you without all of this." He gestured vaguely around them, encompassing the opulent restaurant, the weight of his name, the expectations that came with it. "I've spent my whole life being seen because of my money, my family. I wanted something real." Her stomach twisted. She could understand that, but it didn't erase the sting of knowing he had let her believe he was someone else. "So what was your plan? Just keep pretending?" "No," he said immediately. "I was going to tell you, I didn't want this to change what we have." Her breath caught. "What we have?" As if it was something fragile, something worth protecting, and maybe it was. But how could she trust it now? Vanessa pushed her chair back, rising to her feet. "I need to think." Felix stood as well, his expression unreadable. "Vanessa," she shook her head, taking a step back. I need time." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding with every step. The city lights blurred as Vanessa wandered through the streets, her thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of emotions. She had liked Felix, really liked him. But now, she didn't know what was real and what was just a carefully constructed illusion. By the time she reached her apartment, exhaustion settled over her, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, a knock at her door jolted her from her restless thoughts. She hesitated before opening it, her breath catching when she saw Felix standing there. He didn't look like the polished, composed man from the night before. His hair was slightly disheveled, his usual confidence laced with something raw, something vulnerable. "Can I come in?" he asked. Vanessa crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Why are you here?" "Because you walked away last night, and I couldn't let that be the end of it," he said, his voice steady but edged with something desperate. "I know I should have told you the truth sooner. I was afraid that the moment you knew who I was, you'd see me differently, that I'd just be another billionaire to you." She swallowed hard. "And what if I do?" Felix's throat worked as he took a step closer. "Then I'll spend as long as it takes proving to you that I'm still the same man you laughed with over coffee, the same man you walked with through the city, the same man who can't stop thinking about you." Her heart twisted. She wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. "I don't need your money, Felix," she said quietly. His expression softened. "I know. That's why I fell for you." The words settled between them, weaving into something delicate and uncertain. Vanessa inhaled slowly. "I don't know how to do this." Felix reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then let's figure it out. Together." She stared at him for a long moment, searching for any trace of deception, any sign that this was just another illusion, but all she saw was sincerity. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now, Vanessa stood in the doorway, staring at Felix, her pulse thrumming in her ears. His words still lingered between them, heavy with meaning. He wanted this, wanted her, but could she trust it after everything? Felix didn't rush her. He just stood there, waiting, his fingers flexing at his sides as if resisting the urge to reach for her again. She finally stepped back, allowing him inside. The tension in the air was palpable as he crossed the threshold, his presence filling her small apartment in a way that made it feel suddenly too warm, too small. She folded her arms, keeping space between them. "You say you didn't want me to see you differently, but don't you see how that's impossible now?" Felix exhaled, his gaze steady. "I know it changes things, I just don't want it to change us." She shook her head. "There was no us built on truth. You let me think you were someone else." His jaw tightened. "I never pretended to be someone else. I was always myself with you. The only thing I didn't tell you was the size of my bank account." Vanessa swallowed. He wasn't wrong. He had never claimed to be poor, never spun some elaborate lie. He had just omitted the most staggering truth. She paced, running a hand through her hair. "I don't even know what this means." "What would dating you even look like? Fancy restaurants, private jets, paparazzi showing up at my office." Felix's expression darkened slightly. "Is that what you think? That I'd throw you into that world without a second thought?" She turned to face him, frustration bubbling up. "I don't know what to think, Felix. One minute, I'm on a date with a guy who works in construction, and the next, I find out he's a billionaire with board meetings and people like Richard watching his every move." Felix's eyes flickered at the mention of Richard. "He shouldn't have approached us like that. That wasn't how you were supposed to find out." Vanessa let out a dry laugh. "And how was I supposed to find out? Were you just waiting for the right moment to drop it casually into conversation?" His shoulders tensed. "I wanted to tell you. I just needed to know if what we had was real first." She stared at him, her chest tightening. "And now," Felix stepped closer, his voice softer but no less intense. "Now I know it is." The weight of his words pressed against her, and for the first time since she had walked away from him at the restaurant, she allowed herself to remember what had started all of this. The way she had laughed with him, how easy it had been to talk to him, how he had looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. She wanted to believe him. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt in a single conversation. She took a deep breath. "I need time to figure this out." Felix nodded, though there was something guarded in his expression. Then take all the time you need. Just don't shut me out completely. Vanessa hesitated, then gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Felix studied her for a second longer, as if memorizing her face, then turned toward the door. Before he left, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. I meant what I said, Vanessa. I don't want my world to swallow you up, I just want you in it. And then he was gone, leaving her standing in the middle of her apartment, her heart warring with her mind. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time since that night at the restaurant, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to walk away. Vanessa spent the next few days trying to reconcile the man she had fallen for with the billionaire she had just discovered. It wasn't easy. Every time she thought back to their easy conversations, their effortless chemistry, she wondered if she had been blind to the signs, or if Felix had truly been that good at hiding them. But no matter how much she tried to push him out of her mind, he lingered. In the way she reached for her coffee in the morning and remembered their first date. In the quiet moments of her day when she found herself wanting to text him. In the way her heart still reacted at the thought of him. She wasn't sure what scared her more, his wealth, or the fact that she still wanted him despite it. So when Felix showed up outside her office one evening, leaning casually against a sleek black car, she wasn't entirely surprised. Apprehensive, yes, but not surprised. He straightened when he saw her, his expression careful, as if he wasn't sure how she'd react. I know you said you needed time, he said as she stopped in front of him. But I also know that if I don't fight for this, I'll regret it. Vanessa crossed her arms, searching his face. And how exactly are you planning to fight for this? Felix's lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't expected the question. But then, something in his expression shifted, resolve taking hold. By showing you that nothing about me changes just because you know everything now, I don't want my money to be a barrier between us. I just want you to see me. She exhaled, watching him closely. And what if I can't? Felix took a step closer. Then tell me now and I'll walk away. The sincerity in his voice sent a jolt through her. If she told him to leave, he would. No questions, no arguments. He would respect her decision. But the moment stretched between them, and the words never came. Instead, she found herself saying, I don't know how to be in your world, Felix. His gaze softened. Then we'll figure it out together. Vanessa hesitated. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she reached for the door handle of his car. Take me somewhere. Show me something real. Felix's eyes flickered with something unreadable, maybe relief, maybe something deeper. He opened the passenger door for her, waiting until she was settled before getting in himself. They drove in comfortable silence, the city lights blurring past. After a while, they pulled up to a gated entrance. Vanessa frowned as Felix punched in a code, the gates opening to reveal an expansive property. But it wasn't a mansion. It was an unfinished building, scaffolding still in place, the structure only halfway completed. Felix parked and turned to her. This is one of my projects. It's not a luxury hotel or a skyscraper. It's going to be a community center for kids who don't have anywhere else to go. Vanessa blinked, surprised by the rawness in his voice. You never mentioned this. He looked out at the construction site, because I didn't build it for recognition. I built it because I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong anywhere. Something about the way he said it sent a pang through her. Felix, he turned back to her. I wanted you to see this because this is who I am too. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, just a man who wants to build something that matters. Vanessa swallowed hard. She had spent so much time thinking about what it meant to be with a man like him that she hadn't stopped to consider who he actually was. Felix reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. I know it won't be easy, but I don't want easy, I want you. And just like that, the last of her resistance crumbled. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady. Then let's figure it out together. Felix exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. Then, without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. And for the first time since this all began, Vanessa knew she didn't want him to.